So we are talking about a hosting company which was having trouble with managing their growth because basically they were having a quite heterogeneous technical base for their managed systems. They were growing really fast, so they were having new employees regularly, which had trouble integrating and understanding the whole technical environment. They also had new business needs for compliance and new business needs for compliance because a lot of customers were interested in things like PCI DSS, some specific health domain certifications to be able to handle health data on their systems. So they were really interested in improving the compliance of their systems. So they studied different automation solutions. They already had some automation in place, but nothing that covers all the cases. And they decided to use Rudder. So we'll now see how they use Rudder to take control of their existing systems and start getting compliance and applying changes safely to these systems. So the first thing is that they started implementing Rudder automation on their internal nodes, which mean the nodes they use to manage their system. So basically, there was some low risk and very well-known machines. So they started by this to get familiar with Rudder and start using it. So this is the first part, and then after we'll see how they started using Rudder on their customers' machines. So the first thing they had to do was to convert the automation scripts and tools they had in place to use Rudder. So basically, it was quite easy to do because the real difficult step is to go from manual operations to automatic operations in any way. And then once you really know what you are doing, it's quite easy to migrate from one system to another. A little thing we did to ease this migration was to add the support for Jinja 2 templating, because they were using some Python tools before, and they had quite a lot of Jinja 2 templates already done, so they didn't want it to migrate it to what we use in Rudder by default, which is the Mustache templating language. So we added the support for Jinja 2 to Rudder in the Technic editor, which allowed them to just keep the templates and only rewrite the logic around. Jinja 2 has quite a lot more possibilities in terms of data manipulation and so on. So they first migrated their configurations. It was not that hard. And then they had their internal systems. They had migrated their policies. So the next step was to start working on the customer system. So the first part was to change the provisioning process, because it's easier to start with the greenfield nodes because you know what you're doing. You can destroy them, you can retry, which is not the case with existing production systems. So they started by modifying their provisioning procedures. Before, they were using some VM templates that they cloned, and then they were provisioning some configuration using some one-shot tools, some one-shot Python scripts to update configuration on the nodes. But that really led to drift between nodes, because when they changed the templates, it would not update the existing nodes, so they would end up with a lot of different versions of the same role, basically. So it was quite unmaintainable, and so they moved to Rudder. Okay, and so, thank you. And they completely removed all configuration from the VM templates. So they are now using complete standard OS templates. And all the configuration is done by Rudder after provisioning, which means it's exactly the same source of configuration that will be applied on new nodes and on existing previous nodes, which will ensure pretty much will avoid the drift between the different generations of VMs. So well, this is the first part. So now they are completely automated their provisioning process using Rudder. They were able to provision new nodes automatically in the same way they used to maintain the previous nodes. So now they're wanting to start automating and taking control of already installed nodes. And this is where it becomes more complicated because there were production systems that was used by the customers. And a second issue was that some of these systems were administrated with the customers. So the customers had the root access to the servers basically, and they could do any maintenance task without the hosting company knowing it. So they had to be really careful when they started taking control of this using Rudder. So what they used, well, they waited for the Rudder 4.0 release, which includes the Audit Mode. What's the Audit Mode? It's basically the default mode in configuration management is to check the state of the system, and if it's not correct, to fix it and to report back in the case of Rudder. In Audit Mode, what we do is that we just check if the configuration item is correct and report back without doing anything, and it's configurable at the node level or at the configuration policy item level. So you can just say this node is in audit mode, I don't want to touch anything on it, or this particular part of the configuration is in audit mode on all my infrastructure. So what they did is that all the existing nodes they were integrating in Rudder, they would put them in audit mode when accepting them in Rudder. So it would basically apply the expected configuration and check if it was compliant. So this allows seeing every drift that happened and be able to avoid breaking things when actually doing things on the nodes. So that's where it's quite expensive, because they had to manually read every non-compliance and see if it was a problem in the policies or on the nodes and fix them. So this is quite the expensive part, because it requires administrators to look at the errors and just dig into them until they know what's happening and if they can really put the system into compliance, or if they have to modify the rules. So yeah, that's kind of the complicated part, but it's really is with by the use of Rudder, which allows this easy comparison of states. So okay, that's it for the integration of all nodes. So basically, they would run in audit mode, fix the problems, and once it's all green, switch to enforce mode, which means any change in the configuration that will happen later will be done on all the machines, basically, either an old one or something that has been provisioned with a Rudder. They decided to they decided not to touch some very old systems, which they knew were really, really far from any standard they had, and they didn't want to put too much effort in it. But so they restrained this process of taking control of old machines to some quite recent systems. And now they had a third need, which was to integrate Rudder with their configuration CMDB tools, which were actually linked to the customer portals, where customers could say, I want a server with this amount of RAM, this network configuration, and then it would provision everything. So they wanted a connection between this tool, this customer-oriented tool, and Rudder. So what we did was to develop the data sources plugin for Rudder, which allowed synchronizing information about the nodes between their CMDB and Rudder. So basically, the CMDB will fetch all the inventory information from Rudder, compare it with the expected state, and checking if it fits what's expected, and it will also provision some configuration data into Rudder. For example, yes, if we say it's a PostgreSQL server, it will tell Rudder that it needs to be a PostgreSQL server, which version to install, this kind of things. And then in the Rudder policies, it would create some standards node properties that can be used. So this is, for example, an excerpt from a memcached configuration. And you can see we're using a node property which is cmdb.apps.memcached.port. And this property directly comes from the CMDB, which is linked to the customer portal, and it's directly inserted into the configurations. So yeah, it's completely automatic, nothing manual here, and the machines are kept up to date using this synchronization between the two databases. Okay, so we'll sum up the whole process here. So they had to automate a quite legacy and heterogeneous infrastructure. They started by automating something they knew really well that was quite low risk environment. And once they succeeded in this, they started automating all the provisioning process for the new machines, which is easier. And once they had mastered the configuration they needed for new systems, they started comparing it with all systems and applying it gradually to their legacy systems. So basically, this part is completely done, and now they are just looping like this over old nodes and just taking customer after customer, applying configuration, checking the non-compliances, fixing them, and going to enforce mode. And so they're gradually taking control of all the machines. This had led to changes also in the work processes between teams, because now all the teams have access to Rudder, some in read-only mode, but the support team have access to Rudder, so they can check if they have an issue on the node, they can check what is the compliance state, if there is a configuration issue. So this really gives the compliance view to everyone, and everyone is concerned by the compliance now. And they have some projects for the future. What they would like to do is to use the compliance. For now, the compliance is only used internally by the hosting company, but what they would want to do is to expose this compliance information to their customers directly through the Rudder API and the customer portal, to expose the compliance of all the customers' nodes directly regarding some the norms they want to follow, or this kind of information, because that's really what they wanted at the beginning. So that's pretty much the story. So do you have questions? Yeah.
What time frame was this realized by? How long did it take?
Okay. What the question is, what time frame and what time frame was this realized? They did internal things in something like 6 months, I think. Then they waited several months for 4.0 to be out, and the whole provisioning thing was done in several months after this. So it took about 1 year before the beginning of the project and the fully automated provisioning using Rudder. And then they started taking back the old nodes, which is still an ongoing process because it takes time. I think they just manually look at it because yeah, it's.
But there's no standard way, like you start with these 5 files or something.
I don't think so. No. Okay, that's all. So thank you.